Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. We've talked a lot on this channel about vintage lenses, but of course a vintage lens is nothing without a camera to put it on. Digital mirrorless cameras have been around for quite some time now and the technology moves very quickly. And they've been around long enough for there to be quite a few second-hand bargains around. So today we're going to have a look at 3 beautiful little mirrorless cameras that you can buy at a very affordable price. The cameras I'm going to show you today are not quite as highly spec'd as the latest models, but they're still very capable machines. So without further ado, let's have a look at our first of those cameras, and that's the Panasonic GH2. This is a lovely little camera. I've owned this one, for about 7 or 8 years now, and I've found it a really nice little machine for stills and for video. It makes very nice stills, it can take pretty much any lens ever made, and it makes really nice video as well. In fact, all the videos, or most of the videos I shoot on this channel, I've shot with this very camera. And in fact, if you want even higher quality video than this one gives, you can hack it to get a higher bit rate, and then the video really does start to stand up alongside cameras that were made for the professional video market. So it's a very nice video camera and a really nice little stills camera too. It has, and this is what I think is a really great feature of this camera, it has a flippy out screen, a fully articulating screen perhaps would be the better way to describe it. It can be folded around to sit on the camera back, so you've got a live view, you've got the screen on the back there. You can fold it out to actually get a view of what you're shooting as you're shooting. It can come right around to the front. Many other cameras can't do that, strangely enough, and I'm not sure why other camera manufacturers don't build this feature into their cameras, because this, in my opinion, this is a really good feature. Just like other mirrorless cameras, this camera will mount pretty much any lens ever made. There are a few exceptions, lenses whose rear elements project a bit too far backwards into the camera, but those are very, very rare. So on this camera you can mount pretty much anything. One thing you do have to remember with Micro Four Thirds though is that the focal length of any lens you put on the camera is effectively doubled, and please note that word effectively. This is not a magical process, it's just simple optics. Because it has a smaller sensor than full frame, roughly half the size I think, or thereabouts, it looks through only the central portion of the lens, and so the image is effectively magnified. So any lens you put on, this is a 35mm. On this camera, this lens works as a 70mm. So any lens you put on there, it's going to be longer, twice as long as it's actually marked. Another feature that Micro Four Thirds cameras will offer you is the ability to change between quite a few different aspect ratios. So on this one we've got 3:2, 4:3, 16:9 and 1:1 square. I really like square images. Since I had a Polaroid camera many years ago, I've never really lost my liking for the square image format. This camera does it really well, and you do have a great deal of variety with your aspect ratios on these cameras. This camera is now about 10 years old, or at least its design is, and it does show its age in a couple of ways. The screen resolution is not particularly great. It's perfectly usable, but if you look at a modern screen you'll see the difference. The viewfinder is similarly not quite as highly resolved as a more modern camera would be, but I don't find that any particular handicap. it's fully featured in its controls. It's got lots of different focusing options, lots of different shooting options. There is only one control wheel on the back here, but I've found that perfectly adequate. Most of the functions, or many of the functions, have a dedicated button, so it's very easy to navigate through the camera and find where you're going. This camera won't feel lacking. If you're used to a very highly spec'd machine with the full range of adjustments on it, this camera won't disappoint. It does have all of that, and it's a very, very comprehensive little package. It's a very small and light camera too. It's not quite so light when you put a heavy old vintage lens on the front, but in and of itself, it's small and it's light and it's neat, and I do really appreciate that in a camera. I think that the later versions, GH3, GH4, GH5, yeah, they've got a lot more features. They've got, some of them anyway, have 4K video and things like stabilization, which this doesn't have. But I think they're getting rather too big. Maybe the market, I think a lot of the market for the GH cameras is videographers and filmmakers, and perhaps for that market they're not so big. But for day-to-day shooting, they're getting to the size of a DSLR, and I think they've probably got too big. The GH2 is very compact, very small, very light, and I really like it for those qualities. As for price, you can buy a good one of these for £100 body only, and you'll probably find them for less than that as well. So this really is a bargain in mirrorless cameras, and it's one that if you're looking for a mirrorless camera, a good affordable mirrorless option, you could do a great deal worse than checking out this little camera. Very nice little thing indeed. Now you might notice that this shot is a little bit closer, and that's because I've switched from filming with the Sony A7 here, which is the next camera we're going to look at, to the GH2, which we've just discussed, and it's got that 35mm lens on it. But you can see that even with that 35 on it, it's a little bit longer, or the effective focal length is a little bit longer than this camera, which is using a 58mm lens. So anyway, let's go on. The next camera we're going to look at is this extraordinary machine. This is the Sony A7 Mk1. This was the original Sony A7, and it was the first camera with, or at least the first mirrorless camera with, a full frame sensor. And to me, it's been an absolute boon and a godsend over the years. This is the camera that I was waiting for. The great thing about using a full frame mirrorless is that when you use vintage lenses, they behave as designed. They behave as they used to do on the old film cameras, because of course the sensor is the same size as a piece of 35mm negative film. It makes beautiful stills. They have a real depth to them. There is more background blur because the sensor is larger. They feel that bit richer than images from a micro four thirds sensor. They feel to have that little bit more depth. It really does make stunning stills. It shoots really nice video too. It's just beautiful actually. It's very soft. It has a wonderful depth. It has a very high dynamic range. It's just absolutely lovely. It's a very small camera. It can become quite big with adapters, but the camera itself is actually quite small. If I take this lens off and show you, that's a really small camera body. It's not too much bigger than the APS-C cameras that Sony makes, the likes of the A6000 and so on. The only real difference is this hump over the top here for the little TV monitor to go into. There are plenty of control wheels on this camera. There's one at the back here, just within nice easy reach of your fingers. There's an exposure compensation dial right on the top here, just where you want it. There's another control wheel at the front there, just right where your finger falls. And pretty much all of these buttons on the back here and this one button on the front, those are all customizable, so you really can make this camera just how you want it and shoot it just how you want it. Sadly, this camera does not feature a flip out screen. The best it can manage is a tilt up and a tilt down. It's handy and it's useful for if, for example, you're shooting something down on the ground, you don't want to get down there yourself, you can just pull out the screen and shoot it like this, looking at the screen. But the screen isn't ideal. I would like a flip out screen. I think they're a great thing and I don't see why more manufacturers don't fit them. But hey, it is what it is. Unlike the GH2, this one does have a pretty high resolution screen. I couldn't tell you exactly what the measurements are, but you can't really tell it's a screen. It gives you an image that really corresponds pretty much exactly to what's out there. And similarly with the viewfinder, it's a very high res little unit. That does lead me on to speak about one of the problems with this camera, which is the battery life. It's actually pretty poor. At the most I can get 2-3 hours of shooting out of one of these batteries. It has a very large sensor and that takes a lot of power to drive. Also, like all mirrorless cameras, there is no passive option to view what you're seeing. You can't just look through the lens like you did on an SLR or indeed a DSLR. You have to look through either look at this electronic screen on the back or through the electronic viewfinder. And on the A7, I think I'm right in saying, do correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right in saying that the viewfinder takes more current than the screen does, even though it's much smaller. So either way, any way you look at it, this camera is a juice monster. It just loves its volts and its amps, and the batteries don't last long. It should be larger. It's actually only quite a small battery, which I'll show you. It really isn't big at all. It fits in, I'm sure it would fit into the palm of my hand many times over, and it's not a big battery and it doesn't have a high capacity. Another thing you may encounter are the occasional reflection of the sensor. Why this camera should suffer from that any more than any other, I don't know, but it does occasionally, and it is only very occasionally, suffer from it, mainly when shooting outside at night and there are a lot of bright lights around. But these things are minor, make no mistake. This is a very, very capable camera. It's probably my favourite of my digitals. It's a beautiful little thing. And it's difficult to think of a digital camera that would make nicer images than this one does at the price. This must be the cheapest, or certainly one of the cheapest, or almost the cheapest full-frame digital camera you can buy. Certainly the cheapest full-frame digital mirrorless you can buy. And good ones of these, I've seen them go for around £500, and while that's quite a bit more than the GH2, it is quite a bit more camera. I think this camera is really a bargain right now. It's well worth every penny of those £500. I've had a great deal of fun out of this one, and it's a lovely camera to shoot. You could not do better for an affordable mirrorless digital camera. So finally today we're going to look at this little camera. This is another beautiful little thing. It's another micro four thirds camera. It's the Olympus Penlight EPL5. The pen cameras are really interesting little things in themselves, and they take a totally different approach to the mirrorless idea than, for example, the Micro Four Thirds GH2. This is much more of a fun camera. It kind of feels almost like a snapshot camera, actually. It has lots of menus which you have to dive into on the screen here, and some of them are a little bit fiddly. Don't be fooled though, this is a very powerful, very fully featured little camera. It's not a snapshot camera by any means, despite how it might feel. It has on the top here a control wheel with all the things that you'd expect to find there, PASM modes as well as art filters and scene modes and auto. It's a tiny camera. It's really, really small, and it's beautifully made to hold in your hand. I don't know, it just feels like a quality machine. It doesn't have a flip out screen, unfortunately, but it does have a screen that folds out in quite a number of different ways. You do get quite a lot of flexibility with this screen. You can extend it, you can point it up, you can point it down. Sadly, you can't flip it around, but there we are. We can't have everything. No focus peaking on this camera, just the same as the GH2. The A7 does have it. I should have mentioned that the A7 has focus peaking. Focus peaking is a brilliant focusing aid where the outline of what you're focusing on glows in a different colour to delineate it and define it from the rest of the scene. It's not foolproof. It's not quite as good as the split prism in a film SLR was, but it's a real good focusing aid. This one doesn't have it. There's no viewfinder, but you can buy one. I'm so used to viewfinders that when I was shooting this camera recently, I did actually instinctively put it up to my eye a couple of times, and of course there wasn't a viewfinder there, but there is a very nice one available from Olympus, and it just pops on the top here, and that gives you your viewfinder function. It makes fantastic stills, and the colours are rather nicer, I think, than they are from the GH2. The GH2 sometimes gives rather flat colours, but Olympus are well known for their outstanding colour rendering, and they are nicer, and they do bring the image to life a little more. You might find with the GH2 there's a bit more time spent on post-processing. With this one you get beautiful colours straight out of the camera, and I really like the art filters as well. They might be frowned upon by some people. I don't frown upon them. I think they're wonderful. They give, they're in the spirit of this camera's fun approach to photography. This is a really fun little camera, and it celebrates image making. I really like it. It's got a Jupiter 8 on the front, little micro four thirds to L39 adapter there. It could have been made for the camera. It just looks perfect. It sits perfectly on the camera. It gives an effective 100mm focal length on this camera, which is great because it's got a bit of reach. A Jupiter 8 and one of these, you won't go far wrong. Absolutely lovely little piece of kit. Most of its functions, though, you will find in menus. And okay, every digital camera has menus, but this one doesn't have that many dedicated controls on the body, so you will find yourself diving into menus to set things like ISO and white balance, which I found a bit inconvenient while shooting, actually. Partly that's because I'm not really used to the camera, I don't really know it, but it is also partly because functions given their own assigned button are always easier to find and always easier to use when you need them in a hurry. Perhaps the best thing about this camera is its price. You can buy these for, well, I've seen them for around £100 to £150 body only. With a lens, you might pay between £150 and £250 depending on the lens. But still, that's a real bargain. A beautiful little camera, and a really capable one too. And one that brings a real fun approach to photography, and I can't help liking it just for that. So there we are, 3 beautiful little mirrorless cameras that you can buy today for very affordable prices. There are lots of others available. If you want to go a little higher in the price range, there are all of the other GH cameras from Panasonic, the GH3, the GH4. There are lots of the Olympus pen cameras from the EP1 right up to the EP5 and beyond. And there are loads of Sony APS-C Nex cameras. Some of those are really cheap now. So there really is no excuse to grab yourself a mirrorless camera, stick a vintage lens on the front, and go out and have some fun. And after all, that's what it's really about. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to help it grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.